What if the person you call a genius worked for it in ways nobody told you about? What if the billionaire you admire wasn't simply smarter, hungrier, or more talented than everyone else, but was standing in the right place, at the right moment, in circumstances almost nobody talks about? What if success isn't what you think it is? Not even close. Today we're dismantling one of the most powerful myths in modern culture, the myth of the self-made person. The story that talent plus hard work equals success. The clean, comfortable, morally satisfying narrative that the people at the top got there because they deserved it most. Malcolm Gladwell spent years collecting evidence that this story is a lie. Not a harmless simplification, not a useful approximation, a lie. And the book he wrote to prove it, Outliers, The Story of Success, is one of the most quietly radical pieces of non-fiction ever published. Because it doesn't just challenge how you see successful people. It challenges how you see yourself, what you believe you're capable of, what you've been told you lacked, and why the system that sorts winners from losers might be far more arbitrary and far more rigged than anyone in power has any incentive to admit. Let's go. Gladwell opens the book with a question that sounds almost too simple to be interesting. When is your birthday? Specifically, what month were you born in? It seems irrelevant, arbitrary, the kind of biographical detail that has nothing to do with intelligence, drive, or potential. And yet Gladwell's research reveals something that should fundamentally disturb anyone who believes in meritocracy. In Canadian junior hockey, the most competitive youth hockey system in the world, the pipeline through which virtually every NHL player passes there is a cutoff date for age group eligibility, January 1st. If you're born before that date, you play in 1 year's cohort. If you're born after it, you play in the next. Simple administrative policy. Completely mundane. Except that when researchers examined the birth dates of elite Canadian hockey players, the ones who made it to the professional leagues, the ones identified early as exceptional talent, they found something staggering. An overwhelming majority were born in January, February, and March. Not because something mystical happens to children conceived in spring, but because a child born in January and a child born in December are, at age 8 or 9, separated by nearly a full year of physical and cognitive development. In a room full of 9-year-olds, that gap is enormous. The January child is bigger, faster, more coordinated, not because of talent, but because of age. Coaches, operating on instinct and pattern recognition rather than awareness of this bias, identify the January child as more promising. They give that child more attention, more coaching, more playing time, more opportunities to develop. The December child, slightly smaller, slightly less coordinated for reasons that have nothing to do with potential, gets identified as average, gets less investment. Gradually, the self-fulfilling prophecy closes around them. By the time these players are teenagers, the gap that began as a birthday has become a genuine skill difference because one child spent years being developed and the other spent years being overlooked. Gladwell calls this the Matthew effect, borrowing from the biblical principle, to those who have, more will be given. The rich get richer, the advantaged get more advantages, and the whole process begins before a child is old enough to understand what's happening to them. If that idea is already making you rethink what you've been told about talent and potential, subscribe right now. Because this channel goes places that most content is too comfortable to go, and we're just getting started. Now let's talk about the concept that made Outliers famous. The idea that launched 1,000 think pieces, misquotes, and motivational posters, and that Gladwell himself has spent years trying to rescue from oversimplification. 10,000 hours. The research behind this number comes primarily from psychologist Anders Ericsson, who studied expert performers across domains, musicians, chess players, athletes, surgeons, and found a consistent pattern. World-class expertise in virtually any complex skill required approximately 10,000 hours of dedicated, deliberate practice. Not passive repetition, not showing up and going through the motions. Deliberate practice, the kind that specifically targets weaknesses, operates at the edge of current ability, and receives consistent feedback. On its surface, this sounds like a pure vindication of the work ethic narrative. Put in the hours, become a master. Simple, empowering, democratic. But Gladwell's genius is in what he asks next. Who gets 10,000 hours? Because 10,000 hours is not just a function of desire, it is a function of access, of time, of resources, of opportunity, of systems that either allow or prevent the accumulation of that practice. And when you examine the biographies of the people who actually achieved that threshold before the world needed them, to the pattern that emerges is not one of individual heroism. It is one of extraordinary, largely invisible, frequently accidental privilege. Enter Bill Gates. Gladwell traces Gates' path to Microsoft with a level of biographical detail that transforms the familiar legend into something almost unrecognizable. Yes, Gates was extraordinarily intelligent. Yes, he worked with ferocious intensity. Yes, he had vision that most people in the early computing industry lacked. None of that is in dispute. But here is what the legend leaves out. In 1968, Gates was a 13-year-old student at Lakeside School in Seattle, one of the only schools in the United States that had a computer terminal at that time. Not a computer lab. A terminal connected to a time-sharing computer. In 1968, when most universities didn't have access to this technology, the Mothers Club at Lakeside had raised money for it. A bureaucratic accident, an institutional quirk, a piece of luck so specific, so improbable, that had Gates attended virtually any other school in the country, the path that followed would have been impossible. But it gets more specific still. The terminal at Lakeside operated on a time-sharing system, which meant usage cost money every time it was accessed. When the school's budget ran out, Gates and his small group of obsessive friends found a way to access a computer at the University of Washington for free during off hours. Then they found a job with a company called ISI that gave them unlimited computer time in exchange for testing their software. By the time Gates dropped out of Harvard to found Microsoft, he had been programming with unusual intensity for roughly 7 consecutive years. In an era when almost nobody on the planet had access to the hours of hands-on computing practice he had accumulated, Gates had approximately 10,000 of them. Was he brilliant? Unquestionably. Was he driven? Beyond any ordinary measure? But was he self-made? Gladwell's answer is decisive and uncomfortable. Nobody is. The story of the Beatles delivers the same argument from a different angle. By the time the Beatles appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964 and ignited Beatlemania across America, they seemed to have emerged from nowhere. 4 young men from Liverpool, exploding onto the world stage with a sound and a presence that felt unprecedented, electric, almost supernatural. What the legend skips is Hamburg. Between 1960 and 1964, the Beatles were invited to play in Hamburg, Germany in strip clubs and rock venues that operated through the night, demanding that bands play 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months at a stretch. The conditions were brutal. The audiences were indifferent or hostile. The pay was almost nothing, but the hours accumulated. By the time they returned to England, they had performed live an estimated 1,200 times. Most bands, even working ones, don't reach that number in their entire career. The Beatles reached it before they were famous. Hamburg didn't make them talented, but Hamburg gave them something that talent alone could never provide. The kind of deep, crisis-tested, instinctive musical fluency that only comes from playing until your fingers bleed, then playing some more, in front of people who don't care whether you're good or not. The world saw the explosion on Ed Sullivan. It didn't see the 10,000 hours in Hamburg that made the explosion possible. But Gladwell pushes even further, because if Outliers stopped at 10,000 hours and lucky circumstances, it would be a fascinating book about external factors. What makes it something more is the way it forces a deeper question. What happens to the people who had the talent, the drive, the raw material for greatness but never got the circumstances? This is where the book stops being interesting and starts being important. Gladwell introduces us to Christopher Langan, a man who tested with an IQ somewhere between 195 and 210, making him by some measures the most intelligent person alive in America at the time of his testing. A man who taught himself to read at 3 years old, who mastered physics, mathematics, philosophy, and Latin largely on his own, who could absorb and retain information at a speed that left researchers struggling for adequate description, and who spent much of his adult life working as a bouncer on Long Island. The contrast with Gates and the Beatles is not one of intelligence or talent or work ethic. It is one of something Gladwell calls practical intelligence, a concept borrowed from psychologist Robert Sternberg that refers not to raw cognitive ability, but to the social and navigational knowledge of how to get what you want from the world, how to read a room, how to talk to people in power, how to ask for what you need, how to advocate for yourself within institutions, how to make systems work for you rather than against you. Gates learned this partly from temperament, partly from environment, partly from parents who modeled it, partly from a childhood in which he was consistently taught that he had the right to engage with authority on his own terms. Langer never learned it. He grew up in poverty, in instability, with no model for how to navigate institutions. When he lost his financial aid at college due to a bureaucratic error, he didn't know how to appeal it. He didn't know that appealing was even an option. He left, and the trajectory of a mind that might have reshaped entire fields of human knowledge closed quietly around him. Not because he wasn't brilliant enough, because nobody taught him the rules of the game that everyone pretends isn't being played. There's a rice paddy in southern China that Malcolm Gladwell wants you to think about. Not metaphorically. Literally. A small, flooded field of rice in the Pearl River Delta region, tended by a farming family sometime in the 9th or 10th century. A family working in conditions that would break most modern people within a week, bent at the waist for hours, managing water levels with surgical precision, planting and harvesting in cycles that demand constant, obsessive attention to detail. Gladwell wants you to think about this rice paddy because he believes it explains something about mathematics test scores in the 21st century. And the connection, once he draws it, is one of the most stunning arguments in the entire book. Rice farming, unlike wheat farming, is not a matter of scale and strength. You cannot simply plough more land and expect more output. Rice paddies are small, intensely managed ecosystems where yield is almost entirely a function of the quality and consistency of care applied. A farmer who works with more precision, more attention, more willingness to make hundreds of micro-adjustments across a growing season produces dramatically more than a farmer who works the same hours with less care. The work is also year-round. While European wheat farmers had significant portions of the year with little to do winter months that enforced rest, recovery, and a cyclical relationship with idleness, rice farmers in southern China worked virtually without pause. The growing season demanded it. The ecosystem demanded it. The economics of survival demanded it. And over generations, Gladwell argues, this created something that went deeper than habit. It created a cultural relationship with work, a set of values, beliefs, and cognitive orientations around effort, persistence, and the connection between input and outcome that became embedded in how entire communities understood the world. The proverb he quotes captures it precisely. While European peasants said things roughly equivalent to "God provides," southern Chinese farming communities operated under a different principle. No one who can rise before dawn 360 days a year fails to make his family rich. Not God, not luck, not talent, hours, effort, precision, sustained over time, without complaint, without the expectation of shortcuts. Now here is where Gladwell makes the leap that ties this to the 21st century. Researchers studying mathematics performance across different national and cultural groups noticed a pattern that defied easy explanation. Students from East Asian backgrounds, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, consistently outperformed their Western counterparts on international mathematics assessments by significant margins. Across decades, across different countries and educational systems, the standard explanations were debated endlessly. Genetics, teaching methods, curriculum design, cultural emphasis on education. But Gladwell points to something more specific and more interesting. There is a mathematics assessment called the TIMSS, one of the most comprehensive international tests of student ability. Before students sit the exam, they are asked to fill out a long background questionnaire. So long, in fact, that many students don't complete it. They give up partway through. Researchers discovered that the percentage of questions a student completed on that background questionnaire, a pure measure of persistence and willingness to do tedious, unrewarded work, was almost perfectly predictive of their mathematics score. Students who finished the questionnaire did better on the math test. Students who gave up on the questionnaire did worse. The correlation was so strong that you could rank countries by their questionnaire completion rate and produce almost exactly the same ranking as their mathematics scores. In other words, the gap in mathematics performance between cultures may have less to do with innate aptitude or even specific educational practices, and more to do with a culturally transmitted relationship with effort, with the willingness to persist through difficulty without immediate reward. And that relationship, Gladwell argues, has roots that go back centuries, to rice paddies, to farming cultures that learned, across generations, that effort applied with precision and consistency produces outcomes that shortcuts never can. Success, in this framework, is not individual. It is inherited. not genetically, culturally. It is passed down through stories, proverbs, expectations, and the subtle daily modeling of what work means and what it's for. Now, let's talk about something Gladwell explores that most conversations about this book completely overlook, and that I think is the most personally confronting section of Outliers. He examines plane crashes. Specifically, he examines why certain airlines from certain countries had dramatically higher accident rates than others, despite flying the same aircraft, in the same skies, under the same regulatory frameworks. What he discovers has nothing to do with mechanical failure, weather, or pilot skill in the conventional sense. It has everything to do with culture, specifically with what linguist Geert Hofstede calls power distance, the degree to which a culture accepts and expects unequal distribution of power between people of different status. In high power distance cultures, you do not challenge authority. You do not correct your superior. You do not say, clearly and directly, that the person above you is making a mistake even when lives depend on it. And in the cockpit of a commercial aircraft, where the captain is the absolute authority, and first officers and flight engineers occupy clearly subordinate positions, this cultural disposition became lethal. Gladwell analyzes the black box transcripts of multiple crashes and finds a pattern that is almost unbearable to read. First officers who knew something was wrong, who had the information that could have saved everyone on board, who tried to communicate it but did so through hints, suggestions, softened language, carefully deferential phrasing designed not to challenge the captain's authority, and captains who, operating in a fog of fatigue or overconfidence or cognitive bias, missed the hints. Because they were hints. Because the first officer's cultural programming would not allow him to say, clearly and without softening, "We are going to crash if you don't change course right now." The crash, in these cases, was not a failure of technical skill, it was a failure of communication rooted in cultural inheritance. Values about hierarchy and deference that were entirely appropriate in many areas of life, that reflected genuine wisdom about social cohesion and respect, became catastrophic in the specific context of a cockpit where flat, direct, unambiguous communication was the difference between life and death. Korea's airline, Korean Air, was one of the most dramatic examples. After a series of devastating crashes in the 1990s, the airline brought in outside consultants to overhaul their safety culture. One of the most significant interventions was requiring that all cockpit communication be conducted in English rather than Korean, not because Korean was technically inadequate, but because the power distance dynamics embedded in Korean language and social structure, the grammatical markers of hierarchy, the linguistic expectations of deference were so deeply encoded that switching languages helped crews access a different cultural register, one where directness was more natural, where challenge was less transgressive. The crash rate plummeted. Success and survival required understanding not just individual skill, but the cultural software running underneath it. This is the moment I want you to feel the full weight of what Gladwell is building toward, because by this point in Outliers, the argument has accumulated enough evidence to become something more than intellectual. It becomes moral. If success is this shaped by circumstance, by birth month, by the school you happen to attend, by the computer terminal a mother's club happened to fundraise for, by the cultural inheritance you received without choosing it, by the decade you were born into and the opportunities that decade either offered or withheld, then what does that mean for how we judge people? What does it mean for the person who didn't make it? The Christopher Langan who ended up as a bouncer instead of a Nobel laureate? The December-born hockey player who was identified as average at 9 years old and never given the development investment that might have revealed his actual ceiling? Gladwell is not arguing that effort doesn't matter. He is not saying that talent is irrelevant or that choices have no consequences. He is saying something more precise and more demanding. He is saying that we have built a culture that tells a story about success, a story of individual heroism, of talent rewarded, of hard work vindicated that is not just incomplete but actively harmful, because that story causes us to credit the successful for advantages they didn't earn and blame the unsuccessful for disadvantages they didn't choose. It causes us to build systems that double down on existing advantage and call it meritocracy. It causes us to look at the Bill Gates of the world and say, see what's possible, without asking how many equally brilliant, equally driven people never got the computer terminal, never got the Hamburg, never got the January birthday, never got the parents who taught them that they had the right to push back against institutions. It causes us to waste an almost incomprehensible amount of human potential quietly, systematically, generation after generation, and then blame the wasted potential on the people who were wasted. So where does Gladwell leave us? He ends Outliers with something unexpected, something personal. He traces his own story, the story of a biracial man born in England, raised in Canada, whose mother came from Jamaica. And he follows the chain of circumstance, luck, cultural inheritance, and historical accident that produced the specific conditions of his own life and career. He does this not to celebrate himself. He does it to demonstrate, with the most intimate evidence available, that he too is a product of forces larger than himself, that his success, real as it is, cannot be honestly claimed as purely his own without acknowledging the web of circumstances that made it possible. And then he makes the argument that I think is the true heart of the book. If we understood success this way, not as individual achievement to be hoarded and celebrated, but as something produced by communities, by history, by systems of opportunity, we might feel differently about what we owe each other. We might invest differently in the communities that produce future talent. We might design schools that don't sort children by arbitrary cut-off dates and then mistake the sorting for merit. We might build institutions that teach not just content, but the practical intelligence, the navigational knowledge that currently gets passed down only in certain homes, to certain children, in certain zip codes. We might stop asking, why didn't they work harder? And start asking, what would have been possible if they'd had what the successful ones had? The lie that success exposes is not the lie that hard work matters. Hard work matters enormously. The lie is that hard work is sufficient, that it operates on a level playing field, that the outcomes we see reflect the talent and effort that went in, cleanly and fairly, without the thumb of circumstance pressing down on the scale. It doesn't. It never has. And the first step toward building something better, toward a world that wastes less human potential, that tells a more honest story about what people are capable of when given what they need, is to stop telling ourselves the comfortable version, to look at the outlier and ask not just what did they do, but what were they given? And then to ask, with everything that follows from that question, what are we giving and to whom right now? If this video shifted something in how you see success, failure, or your own story, I genuinely want to hear it. Drop a comment below and tell me, what circumstance in your own life, looking back, shaped your path in ways you didn't recognize at the time? Because that conversation, the honest one, the one that goes beneath the highlight reel, is the one that actually changes things. Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell is not a comfortable read, but the most important books never are. They don't confirm what you already believe. They crack it open. And in the space that opens up, if you're willing to sit with the discomfort, something closer to the truth has room to breathe. And sometimes, that's exactly where everything begins to change.